Thank you Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Have you ever wanted to paint beautifully translucent watercolors like this? If so, keep watching because today I'm sharing 5 essential tips to help you achieve the ultimate transparency with your pigments. Using this tulip and non-granulating ultramarine from Schminke, I'll guide you through each step to create stunning transparent effects. Pay close attention to tip number 4. It's the most crucial part of this technique. While it might not be obvious when looking at the final painting, this step is essential and often overlooked by watercolor beginners. Mastering this secret will unlock the full potential of your watercolor washes and help you create some truly magical translucent effects. So when you're ready, let's get started. The first secret you need to know is to use very diluted paint, more diluted than what you're probably used to. Notice that on my palette, it's practically pure water with just a hint of color that I grabbed with the tip of my brush and mixed into my water to give it just a hint of blue. You may have heard this analogy before in various places. Your watercolor comes out straight from the tube looking creamy like yogurt, and you need to mix in a fair bit of water in order to make any painting go smoothly. Typically, you're looking to achieve the consistency of milk for some very saturated, vibrant segments, or the consistency of tea for lighter parts. In this case, it's definitely closer to tea, but very diluted kind of tea. If you add too much pigment to water, the entire transparency effect won't work because we need to give ourselves some room to add several transparent layers of color, one on top of the other. Now, the way I add contrast and make sure that the overall silhouette isn't lost against the white background is by adding more saturated paint around the edges. The trick is to do it before your petal is completely dry, so notice that I cover the entire petal with my diluted blue mixture first. This one resembles the tea consistency, and then I grab more saturated paint, the one that's more like cream, straight from that blob of blue on my palette and gently apply it around the edge so the darker pigment can flow towards the center. It doesn't go too far because a few minutes have passed and the petal is slowly drying out, and you may even add a few veins in the center of the petal like I'm going to do here, from the edge and down to the center of the flower. You may recognize this technique from the blue orchid tutorial. It's called wet on damp, meaning we're adding saturated color to particularly dry petal. It's not wet and it's not dry just yet, so this technique is somewhere in between the classic wet on wet and wet on dry. You want to catch that brief period right after you apply your background color when your painting surface is not fully dry. There's a little bit of moisture still present and the paint can move slightly, but your strokes are still visible. And another trick I'm going to show you is called lifting, and it's going to help us create a few subtle highlights. Again, it's best to do it before your paint is completely dry, so without wasting any time, I'm going to grab a clean flat brush, tap it on tissue paper to get rid of extra water, and use the edge to gently lift the paint from those areas where I want the highlights to appear. The key is to avoid straight lines. Instead, you want to curve your brush and drag it along the petal, just like we did with the veins, from the edge and towards the base, or the other way around, from the base and towards the edge, so you follow the organic shape and the highlights you're creating look natural and realistic. Now I'm going to add a few veins using wet on damp technique with some saturated creamy blue paint and my smaller brush. You want to use 2 brushes for this type of work, one for covering larger areas with diluted paint. I would go with a round brush in size 3 or 4, something soft but precise. It will give you more coverage faster, and natural brushes work best for this part. And then when you're ready to paint the edges and the veins, switch to size 1 or even 0, and as I always mention, synthetics will actually work better here compared to natural brushes because they don't load too much water and you will avoid accidents, avoid spilling too much pigment on your freshly painted surface, and at the same time take advantage of the stiffness that comes with synthetic hair. It will give you more precise application. My brush is from Escoda, it's called Kronos, and it's one of my my favorites for this type of work. Now, the important part is to let everything dry out completely before we proceed, and in the meantime, allow me to tell you briefly about the sponsor of this video. Squarespace is a very powerful online platform, the one I'm currently using to build my illustration portfolio and to organize all the different products and services that I offer as part of my creative practice. The most impressive feature by far is their guided design system. They call it the Squarespace Blueprint. It's super easy to use. You don't need to be an expert in web design. Simply choose one of their beautiful professional layouts, adjust the flexible templates as much as you want. You can add text, images, video, courses, and even online memberships directly on your website. And your website will automatically be optimized to look great on any phone or desktop computer, so your work can get discovered more often and by more people. Visit Squarespace for a free trial and use my custom link to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. I let everything dry out completely before I start working on the next set of petals, and this is the most important piece of advice that I have to share, the one that's absolutely essential in order to accomplish this technique successfully. You may recall when I painted the first two petals, I started on the opposite sides of the flower, first painting the top, then the bottom petal. The idea is to work first on the petals that are not touching, so each segment can dry out on its own. And I followed by another set of two petals on top, but only after the first two were completely dry. Now I waited again and I'm re-wetting the next petal with diluted blue, then adding some darker blue around the border. And everything underneath my current wash is completely dry. When I say dry, I mean bone dry. There's no moisture because I waited an entire day between these two steps. Depending on your climate, 2-3 hours is probably enough, but if you're impatient, you can use the hairdryer to speed up the process. I tend to avoid hair dryers because I suspect they might affect the vibrancy of my pigments, but it's totally acceptable if you're in a rush. I typically work on something else, in this case a rather elaborate composition with red peony flowers. I will be offering this as a demo on my Patreon or potentially as a live demo that I'm working on with Terracotta Online Art School. I just haven't decided yet, but this one's going to be really big and really exciting. Now back to our transparent tulip. The foundation of this particular technique, where we create translucent layers, is the drying time in between. You want to let the first layer of paint settle and only then follow up with additional details on top. What happens if your first layer is not fully dry, maybe still a little bit damp, like 20 minutes after you started, is that the next wash will interfere and start blending and dissolving all the crisp edges. It's inevitable because watercolor is meant to move with water, and so if you don't allow your first wash to settle completely, you will be disturbing particles of paint with your brush, and you really want them to stay still while you're adding new details on top. One of the things that I like to do at this stage is to add some petal folds for some extra visual interest. Essentially, these are smaller segments where the petals curve, and I'm using negative painting technique, meaning I just paint the shadow underneath the curved segment, defining the light area with darker color and blending it out so my blue shadow can melt and disappear into the background. I also want to add some extra detail on this petal to accentuate the silhouette, and I'm going to re-wet the entire surface and then add some darker blue around the edges and maybe some veins throughout. For the stem, I decided to use some very muted aqua green from Winsor & Newton, and for the stamens, some moody dark indigo, painting them as if the flower is cut in half and we can actually see every detail on the inside. Now a few finishing touches and extra folds, and I think we can move on to the leaves, but I want to mention something very important before we leave our blue and switch to green, because the type of pigment you choose for this technique matters a great deal. So remember how I mentioned in the beginning that I'm using non-granulating ultramarine blue from Schminke? This aspect is key because if I were to use granulating ultramarine, which is a lot more popular version of ultramarine, or any other granulating color, you would see a lot of texture right away and it would make even the lightest layers too busy and remove the translucency that we're after. If you're just starting with watercolors and you don't know which pigments granulate, simply look at the tube, or better yet, check the manufacturer's website and note that some pigment names feature a letter G next to them. G stands for granulating, or they clearly state that the pigment granulates, and for this type of work, you want to avoid them. Stick to transparent staining colors, the ones that have a clear circle like this next to the pigment name and a high rating when it comes to their staining abilities. For the leaves, I will stick to my aqua green. This time, not mixing it with indigo, just applying a very translucent wash, the same way I did on the petals. First creating the overall shape, then adding some saturated color around the edges. A little line in the center to indicate the shadow on the leaf stem, and some lifting technique to create more pronounced highlights. Again, just like I did on the petals, I'm simply using a clean damp brush, dragging it along up and down to remove some of the color from the parts of the leaf that are facing the source of light. The second leaf is a bit more curved, and now you're familiar with the process, you can guess what I'm going to do next. Some light color all over using a larger round brush, and then some lifting with my flat brush, followed by more saturated pigment around the edges using a size 0 brush, very gently just inserting a few drops of pigment here and there, watching it spread while the leaf is slowly drying. Our next tutorial on Patreon will be using this exact technique. I'm thinking of doing some purple and pink flowers for the real-time version with more detailed instruction. So thank you to all my Patreon subscribers for supporting my channel and the work we do here. Next week, I'm going to show you how to paint a penguin using the classic wet on wet and wet on dry technique. So don't forget to subscribe. You don't want to miss it. It's a lot of fun and very beginner-friendly tutorial. In the meantime, if you want to learn more about the lifting technique in particular, check out this detailed tutorial on my channel, either by clicking on a thumbnail above, or you can use the link in the video description. Thank you for watching and painting with me. I will see you soon.